George Floyd was killed, sparking protests around the world. Nikole Hannah-Jones is also the recipient of a MacArthur Fellowship, the so-called Genius Award, as well as a Peabody Award and a George Polk Award. She co-founded the Ida B. Wells Society for Investigative Reporting, which is dedicated to increasing the ranks of investigative reporters of color. Nikole Hannah-Jones, welcome back to Fresh Air, and congratulations on the Pulitzer and the 1619 Project. So I want to get to that first sentence in your new article. It feels different this time. What are some of the changes you see coming out of the protests that makes you think it's different this time?
Thank you for having me on the show again. The first thing is the sustained nature of these protests. It hasn't been just a few days. It's been weeks, in some places, of daily protests. It is how far spread the protests are. Protests have occurred in all 50 states. Protests have occurred in all white towns with pretty terrible racial track records. It's the multiracial nature of the protests. Oftentimes these protests are almost exclusively or very heavily black, but we are seeing protesters of all races. And it's also the multi-generational nature of the protest. You're seeing, everyone from little kids to elderly people on canes. So that definitely is something that feels different, as well as how quickly some of the changes are occurring. People have been, for instance, protesting and trying to fight to get Confederate monuments and other monuments to people who openly engaged in white supremacy down for decades. And now all of these jurisdictions that said they didn't have the power nor the will to do it are doing it overnight. We in New York already have a police reform bill that passed in the State House, getting rid of chokeholds, trying to force the names of police officers who have been accused of violating certain protocols and practices to be made public. So in some ways, you've seen very swift changes that we have not seen before because of the sustained nature of the protest. But I should say that with a caveat, the larger, more important and structural changes, of course, have not occurred yet.
Yeah, I want to quote from your article. You write, "If we're truly at the precipice of a transformative moment, the most tragic of outcomes would be that the demand be too timid and the resolution too small." So you would like to see this moment lead to a national conversation about reparations. So what does the word reparations mean to you?
Reparations to me, and if you notice in the piece, which is quite long, we don't even use the word reparations until the very end section of the piece because it's such a charged word. But what it means to me is it is restitution. It is when a country or a community or a corporation that has done something egregious to a person or a group of people tries to restore or repair the damage that was done. And that is what reparations is to me. In the context specifically of Black Americans, reparations has to do with 250 years of chattel slavery, followed by another 100 years of legalized segregation or apartheid and racial terrorism, and how that impacted the economic well-being of Black Americans, how that prevented generation after generation Black Americans from acquiring the type of wealth or foothold in the economy that allows you to live a life that is much more typical of white Americans, that allows you to truly take advantage of the bounty of this country. So reparations to me is about repair.
You said that this conversation about reparations actually dates back to the period just after the emancipation of enslaved people. What was the conversation like then? What was being discussed?
Well, actually, the concept of reparations for slavery begins even before emancipation. Enslaved people who had gotten their freedom had begun trying to sue to get some kind of compensation for their enslavement even during slavery. But what happens at emancipation, we are often taught in this country that Black people are emancipated and then everyone is on an even footing. we don't often question what does that mean to be emancipated after 250 years of bondage, to be emancipated with no job, no home, no money, no clothes, no bed, no pots, nothing. Enslaved people were unable to own anything or to accrue anything at all. And so what happens at emancipation is this expectation that the government should help formerly enslaved people to get a foothold. And what Black people wanted more than anything was land. They didn't want dependency on the government. They wanted to be given some of the land that they had worked for generations so that they could become independent, so that they could make their own money and be independent of the white people who had ruled over them. And there were Black men who had served in the Union Army. There was a meeting that was held between some of these men and some generals from the Union Army, and they asked, well, what do you want? And what they said is, we want land. We want land so that we can be prosperous and be our own people. So General Sherman takes that to heart, and he issues Field Order Number 15. And Field Order Number 15 declares that Black families will get 40 acres of former Confederate land, and that they will be able to work that land. And actually, at the time, it was a loan. It wasn't even being given to enslaved people. It was on loan, and they would eventually make enough money and pay for the land. And for a brief period of time, this is what happened. A small number of formerly enslaved people in the Georgia Sea Islands and in coastal South Carolina had the land that they had once worked for white people turned over to them, and they began to farm it. But unfortunately, that period was very, very brief. President Lincoln was assassinated, and he was replaced by his vice president, Andrew Johnson, who was a Southerner, who was a white supremacist, and who believed, like many white Americans at that time, that Black people were deserving of nothing after slavery, that they should be grateful for their freedom. And he confiscated the land and returned the land to the former Confederates. And that ended the only real effort in the history of this country to provide reparations for those who had been enslaved. And it really left formerly enslaved people in absolute devastating poverty. There are stories of mass starvations of Black people after they had been freed, having to leave the plantation and find shelter in burned out buildings, trying to forage for food in burned out fields. It was a devastating period for Black people, and this country decided that it was going to do nothing, that it owed these people nothing.
And the Black people who had been enslaved had worked their lives for no pay, no property, no right to keep their family together, and slavery ends and they get nothing. They're left with nothing.
Exactly. I mean, think about this great wealth that was literally created through their labor. And the way that the laws around slavery were is that Black people could not own property. As property, they could not own property. So anything that they accrued, everything that came from their labor, went automatically to the people who owned them. Their children belonged to the people who owned them. It was illegal for Black people in many places to even make a will. You could not have heirs if you were Black. You could not bequeath anything onto your children. So everything that you earned, that you made, all of the products of your labor went to the enslavers.
Some people might be thinking, well, but slavery was so long ago. But as you point out, the history of slavery in the U.S., well, it actually starts before the U.S. was the U.S., but if you go back to the colonies, the history of slavery here is longer than the history of freedom for Black people.
Absolutely. So we practiced slavery in the British colonies that would become the United States starting in the year 1619. So for 250 years. We have not had slavery in this country for 150 years. But even that is a little misleading because, of course, the end of slavery is followed by a 100-year period of legal discrimination in this country. So black people have only had full rights of citizenship. We have only lived in a country where it was not legal to discriminate against people simply because they descended from those who had been enslaved for a half a century. My father was born into a country where discrimination against black people was legal. My father was born on a sharecropping farm, a cotton farm in Greenwood, Mississippi, where our family had once been enslaved. So we like to think that this was a long time ago. And 150 years is a long time, but when you think about the cumulative nature of disadvantage, I think it's not that long at all.
So I just want to take note of the fact that in your writing, you don't use the word slave, you use the word enslaved person or enslaved people. And it's an interesting distinction, and I want you to talk about that.
Yes, so it was very important in the 1619 Project, and whenever I write about this, to not use language that further dehumanizes people who every system and structure was designed to dehumanize. I think when we hear the word slave, we think of slavery as being the essence of that person. But if you call someone an enslaved person, then it speaks to a condition. Slavery was not. These people were not slaves. Someone chose to force them into the condition of slavery, and that language to me is very important, as is using the word enslaver over slave owner, because these people didn't have a moral right to own another human being, even though the society allowed it. And I think it needs to be active, that this was an active system of people choosing to treat other human beings as property.
Let's talk about the wealth gap. You write about how black people haven't had the generational wealth to pass on to their children and to their grandchildren, and you trace that back to slavery and back to post-Reconstruction and back to segregation in the South. And you also describe the difference between income and generational wealth. So let's start there.
Sure. So income is what you get in your paycheck. You go to work, you work a certain hours a week, and then you get a paycheck. And that's what most of us use to pay our bills every month. But wealth is your assets minus your debts. And so wealth tends to be something that we don't create just on our own. A lot of us in this country inherit wealth, and we get money from our family members if we want to go to college or we want to purchase a home. So wealth is what's actually accumulated over time. Very few Americans have created all of their wealth on their own. It's passed down through generations and then built upon. Black Americans never really had a chance to do that. Of course, 250 years of slavery where they're unable to accumulate any capital. And then coming out of slavery, Black Americans faced a dragnet of discrimination and segregation that further prevented them from building any type of wealth. Black people were denied access to colleges, were denied access to high schools, were denied access to higher paying jobs. And when Black people were able to get some land or to build a business, oftentimes they faced those businesses being stolen or burned down or destroyed. So we saw really from 1619 until 1968, when the last of the civil rights legislation was passed, saying you could no longer discriminate against Black Americans, Black people being denied access to the primary wealth building tools, home ownership, federally financed loans, the GI Bill to be able to purchase housing that white Americans use to build their wealth. And so what we see today is this stark chasm that was built up over generations, and then only made worse by the fact that today Black Americans still face discrimination across the spectrum of American life.
Do you see reparations as cash, as opportunity, as jobs, as housing? What do you think is the best way of doing something with lasting impact and with impact that could last over generations?
I think that reparations can't just be any one thing. I think that you have to have targeted investment in Black communities and Black schools that have been generationally under-resourced. You certainly need to have a commitment to strong enforcement of existing civil rights laws, because reparations don't do any good if you're still facing rampant employment and housing and educational